begin our story of the market revolution in the South, we should probably look at a very significant invention in the history of America, and that is, of course, the cotton gin. Cotton gin, invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney. A relatively simple machine. What it does was a mechanical engine which had a fine-tooth comb which could tear through the cotton fibers and separate the seeds out. Why is this important? Because cotton bolls have a lot of seed in them. The only kind of cotton that America had really been able to grow profitably before was long staple cotton, which had less seeds and was easier to process. But the amount of time that it took to clean and take the seeds out of short staple cotton meant that it could never be produced in very high volume at all. That is, until the invention of the cotton gin. Now, Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin, but it was a relatively simple machine. It was easy to make. It was easy to produce yourself. Eli Whitney actually died penniless because he was not able to make much money off of his fabulous invention because it was so easily copied, right? But the important effect of the cotton gin is that it now makes growing cotton profitable. Now, two things, right? First of all, why do they need cotton? Well, remember the textile mills that we talked about in England last time. They need cotton to run. Ditto for the cotton mills in the American North. So cotton becomes a very hot commodity as it is exported to the rest of the world to feed the cotton mills, which are starting to produce clothing, which is becoming much cheaper and more widely available to Americans of every different type of economic background. Right? So, the growth of cotton mills demands more cotton. But where is that cotton going to come from? Well, it's going to come from the American South. Now let's back up a little bit to the end of the American Revolution. If you remember, in Virginia, there had been a manumission movement. Manumission means the freeing of slaves. Why? Well, turns out a lot of Virginians thought that slavery was kind of incompatible with ideas of American liberty. But there was an even more fundamental economic reason for this. The tobacco, which had been grown in Virginia, which had been the old center of slavery in America, it had worn the soil out. The soil was no longer had the nutrients and the nitrogen necessary to grow the tobacco, right? Also, during the Napoleonic Wars, Europe wanted wheat. They needed bread to feed their people, and they couldn't grow it themselves because they were ravaged by the Napoleonic Wars. So they depended upon the Americans to produce wheat and to send it to them. As a result, in Virginia, they shifted over from growing tobacco to growing wheat. Why is this important? It's nowhere near as labor-intensive as tobacco. So, in fact, a lot of that enslaved workforce in Virginia was redundant. It was superfluous. You didn't need them, right? This is so it's not just American revolutionary ideals that leads the Virginians to oppose slavery. It's also the fact that slaves aren't really all that necessary for the growth of wheat. And in 1808, right, when the slave trade was abolished, Virginians looked forward to this date. You know why? Because down in South Carolina, where they grew rice, they still needed more enslaved labor, or at least they thought they did. So the Virginians, they look forward to this day in 1808 when South Carolina would no longer be able to import enslaved people from Africa, and the Virginians would be able to sell off their excess slave population to South Carolina, leaving Virginia to go work in the rice fields of South Carolina. This was the thinking. This is one of the reasons that the Virginians really did approve the abolition of the slave trade, because they thought that they would be able to sell off their excess slave population to the domestic market. But then cotton changes all of that, right? Now that cotton can be grown profitably, all of a sudden, Southerners want slaves again, right? All of a sudden, Southerners who had been talking about the liberty of all individual subjects kind of retreat back into the old lazy habits of racism in order to justify enslaving an entire population. Why? They needed them to grow cotton. You see the expansion of slavery across the South and into the region which we would call the Old Southwest, but which included Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana grew cotton. this cotton, which was so fundamental to the economic growth of the South, this cotton, which guaranteed anybody who owned a cotton plantation astounding profits, right? Southern dreams of wealth and development predicated upon the growth of cotton. And now that cotton could be produced profitably, it's spread all across the West, with significant development of cotton plantations in this area, which we refer to as the Black Belt. There's black soil there in the Black Belt, which was good for growing cotton, and particularly the Mississippi River Valley, right? Once Jefferson consummated the Louisiana Purchase and opened it up for sale through the land offices, wealthy speculators bought up all the land along the Mississippi River because they knew that this would be the most desired cropland for growing cotton. Prices for land along the Mississippi River soared because people realized that if you had a plantation there, if you could grow cotton there, if you could move slaves into that region, you would realize profits beyond your wildest dreams. So as a result, cotton plantation grows across Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and particularly in the Mississippi River Valley. As plantations spread into these areas, the Federalists' worst nightmares are realized because soon Alabama can become a state, Mississippi can become a state, Louisiana becomes a state before either of them. And, we see significant population growth in these areas and the growth of the slave population, the natural growth of the slave population, because in fact, after 1808, there are no newly imported slaves coming in from Africa. So the South, their population grows significantly, which means that because of the 3/5 clause, they have more representation in Congress. And it should come as no surprise to us that the vast majority of the presidents before the Civil War in America were Southern slaveholders. Why? Because the South was truly a slave power. It was a power whose economic development predicated upon slave labor, slaves who grew cotton in the fields of the American South. But it was also because slavery, the presence of enslaved people who counted for 3/5 of a person in the census, meant that Southern states had much more representation in Congress than they probably should have. As a result, we see the tremendous growth of slavery and Southern political power as more Southern states are added to the Union, as Southerners move westward to take advantage of the newly opened land to grow cotton. And of course, this leads to a tremendous expansion of slavery in America. It also leads to a domestic slave trade, right? There are no new African slaves coming in to America, so instead the Americans start transporting slaves and slave people from the older regions of America, from Virginia, the old center of the southern plantation economy, westward into Louisiana, into Mississippi, into Alabama, after 1835, into Texas, right? All of these slaves being sent across the country to work in new fields to grow cotton. This is sometimes called the Second Passage by historians, because enslaved people who had been brought to Virginia or South Carolina, the next generation, their children or their children's children, would then be forced to move a second time across the country to the Mississippi River Valley, most typically, where they would then work on plantations growing cotton. As you can imagine, this was a particularly desperate thing for black people in the American South for a number of reasons. First of all, being sent down the river, being put into coffles and marched across the country to the new plantation where you would be worked alongside all the other slaves who were being marched across the country by the slave drivers to work in the West. That broke up families. People who had been born and raised in Virginia, whose parents had been born and raised in Virginia, now they're forced to move further west to a place which is completely alien to them, cut off from the kin, the family ties, and the land that they had always known before. As degrading and terrible as slavery was, at least they had their family nearby. Well, the domestic slave trade, which sent all of these enslaved people from the east to the west, cut them off from their original their original homelands, and of course their families as well. And there's a tremendous number of African Americans who are displaced each decade from the old South to the new Southwest, to the newly expanding cotton lands in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. In total, somewhere around 1 million African Americans were marched westward during this time period, often driven by slave drivers, to open up territory in the West to the growth and cultivation of cotton. Right? Now, it's not only, of course, African Americans that this has an effect upon, but also upon the Native Americans who used to inhabit much of the territory that is now being turned into cotton-growing land. You can see the location of the 5 so-called civilized tribes, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole. Let's concentrate on the Creek and the Cherokee for a minute, right? The Creek and the Cherokee who lived in western Georgia and eastern Alabama. The earlier generation of American politicians, people like George Washington, maybe even Thomas Jefferson, had believed that Native Americans became quote-unquote civilized, that they would be able to hold on to their lands and become members of a larger American citizenry. But the thing of it is, the early 19th century witnesses a resurgence of racism in America. As we get further away from the American Revolution, these ideas about liberty and independence and equality kind of start to fade into the background, and economic development, rather than the promise of freedom, is what is driving many decisions about the direction that America will take. Of course, we see that the renewed commitment to enslavement of Africans is driven by the commitment of Americans to growing cotton, but also to a new racism, which justifies this enslavement of African and African American people. The truth of it is, the revolutionary generation of Americans had been much more open to the idea of African American equality. As Southerners commit themselves once again to Southern slave labor, they move away from this position and they start to embrace an anti-black racism, which quite frankly is still with us today, saying that, African American people, they cannot assimilate, that, being enslaved, according to one person, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, was a quote unquote positive good. What on earth did he mean by that? Slavery is a positive good? Well, he used this racist justification that slavery was a positive good because it taught slaves, African people, how to be civilized. Now, it is very difficult to imagine a more self-serving justification than that. But nevertheless, these ideas started to take hold. And Southerners retreated into this sort of lazy racism that justified the enslavement of an entire population of people for their economic benefit. And some of these ideas, they started to get pretty wild. In Georgia, there was one theologian who even theorized that black folks and white folks had a different origin story. We were called polygenicists. What's that mean? There was more than one Genesis. There was more than one origin story. There was a black Adam and Eve, and there was a white Adam and Eve. And as you can imagine, what do stories like this do? Well, they say that we are not of a shared common humanity. That, in fact, we are essentially different from one another, and one group of people has an entirely different set of attendant rights than the other group of people. This kind of thinking would have been very odd during the revolutionary generation, but it starts to take full flower in the early 19th century. Why? The simple reason is that belief in African American inferiority, right, justified slavery. And we know now, of course, this was terribly racist and was terribly self-serving. But at the time, Southerners subscribed to racism just exactly because it justified the continued enslavement of African Americans and allowed them to continue to generate profits by growing cotton uninterrupted, right? Well, another group to suffer from the growth of the cotton kingdom across the American South were the American Indians of the old Southwest, particularly the Cherokees of Georgia and the Creeks of eastern Alabama, right? Now, again, these were Indian peoples who had been adapting to Southern ways. But Southerners wanted their land, right? White Southerners wanted their land to grow cotton on that land. And in Georgia, at least, white Southerners had begun squatting on Cherokee and Creek land and started growing their crops, maybe even their cotton, right? Of course, the Cherokees and the Creeks protested, saying that this is land that was given unto us to the federal government, so neither citizens nor the state of Georgia have any right to come into our lands. Actually, the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall agreed. So, actually Indians are not technically citizens of America, meaning that they have different rights, and that Americans are not allowed to go into Indian tribal lands. They're not allowed to go into reservations. So all of these Southerners who were starting to move into Indian lands, squatting on them and growing cotton, they had to leave, at least legally. The thing of it is, you can pass a law, but it's much more difficult to enforce it. And in fact, when John Marshall said that in fact the Cherokees had a right to their land and the white folks who were squatting on their land had to leave, he knew when he issued this judgment that it would not be carried out. He knew that Southerners would not honor this decision. He wanted to be on the right side of history. He knew that it was wrong to violate the rights of Native Americans who were supposed to hold this land in perpetuity. And in fact, the Cherokee land didn't even belong to Georgia, at least not legally. It was federally controlled land. But the thing of it is, John Marshall had no support. The President of the United States at the time, Andrew Jackson, said, okay, well, John Marshall says we can't move into these Cherokee and Creek lands. Let's have him come down and enforce that law, which, of course, he couldn't. And white Southerners continued to move into the Cherokee and Creek lands of Georgia and Alabama, ultimately forcing them to move westward. This was the Indian Removal Act, right? Here the idea was that, according to Jackson and his supporters, Indians and whites, they cannot live together. How different this is than the revolutionary generation where they thought that as long as Indians adopted the white man's ways, they could live together harmoniously. Well, of course, when the Cherokees and the Creeks did not agree to quote-unquote voluntarily relocate to what is today Oklahoma, right? To give up the rich agricultural lands of Georgia and Alabama to move to the barren, arid land of Oklahoma, well, at that point, they were forced to move. That's the Trail of Tears, when the civilized tribes from the southeast were forced westward from what is Georgia and what is eastern Alabama into Oklahoma. And most historians describe this as a genocidal policy on the part of the United States, because anywhere between 25 and 40% of the Cherokees and Creeks who were displaced from Georgia, and especially Cherokees, the Trail of Tears specifically refers to the Cherokee diaspora from Georgia into Oklahoma territory. A huge number of them died along the way. Interestingly enough, before they relocated, a lot of Creeks and Cherokees had begun selling off their land, and they actually traded this land and bought slaves with the money because they recognized that slavery was a form of property recognized under Southern law. So, you see this kind of perverse practice of Native Americans selling their land in order to buy slaves so they can move their property with them as they're displaced to the west. And indeed, Cherokees and Creeks in Oklahoma did continue to own slaves up until the Civil War. Nowhere near in numbers as large as white Southerners did, but there is a history of slave owning amongst the Creeks and Cherokees who were forcibly removed from Georgia and Alabama into Oklahoma. In any case, what's the overall point here? They were forcibly removed from this territory precisely so they could open it up to cotton cultivation. As they were removed, white Southerners quickly moved into the territories that Indians had been displaced from, started planting cotton, and started expanding their plantation economy into those regions.